Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Derek here. Today we are going to be looking at a lab revolving around encryption. And if you looked at or went through rather, the encryption lecture, then you know why it's important. You know that many companies you're probably going to work with or for are going to use it in some way, shape, or form. So it's important to get an idea kind of how it works and how you could implement it on a few popular storage services. So today we're going to look at EBS and S3 encryption specifically, okay? So let's start with EBS. So what you're going to do is first go ahead and navigate to the EC2 console. I'm actually in the EC2 console here, okay? And on the left side, let's go to volumes. And then I have no volumes in this region, which is fine, but let's go ahead and create one. And of course, remember that even though EBS is designed to work hand in hand with EC2, you don't necessarily need to have like EC2 instances running, and you don't really need to specify an instance to create an EBS volume. You can create these volumes and then just attach them later, when you actually do need them. So we're going to pretty much leave all of these settings at their defaults. We are just going to look at this encryption section here and talk about this for a minute. So when we enable encryption on an EBS volume in particular, okay, what it's going to do is it's going to, as it implies, it's going to encrypt this volume that we create. Okay, now it's important to remember that when we do this, if we wanted to create snapshots of this volume, then they will be encrypted snapshots. Okay, you can't create unencrypted snapshots from an encrypted volume. All right, and then the same logic goes for if we wanted to create a new volume from an EBS snapshot, right? You cannot create an encrypted volume from an unencrypted snapshot and vice versa, right? You can't encrypt a snapshot and then create an unencrypted volume using that snapshot. All right, so it has to be aligned, it has to match up. So in this section here, if we were to enable encryption, what we're going to then do is we would specify a KMS key that's actually going to handle the encryption for us. And you can see here that it gives us like key ID, key ARN, key owner. And of course, because this is going to be making calls to KMS, because KMS will be managing the encryption, it will incur, small marginal charges for that based on KMS pricing. But if you had like your own custom key here, you could do that. I'm just using the default kind of AWS provided one here. And that's all you would need to do. So you would just hit create volume, and it's going to start creating our volume here. And then if you scroll over here to this encryption column, you can see that it is in fact encrypted. And of course, if it wasn't, then it would say, unencrypted, obviously. So that is extremely simple, right? Managing and enabling encryption on an EBS volume. Again, you're more than likely going to be enabling encryption on these volumes and working with encryption, so it's important to be familiar with it, kind of what it looks like and how to enable it, how to work with it, and how to manage snapshots that you create from encrypted volumes, right? So when you're using those snapshots and then you're restoring a new EBS volume from that snapshot, then you'll want to make sure you use the appropriate KMS key as well. All right. So we don't need to necessarily sit here and wait for this to be fully created, although it finished already, nice and quick, which is always helpful. But let's go ahead and just hop over to the S3 console now. Okay, so I'm in S3, and I've got some buckets here. All right. So what we're going to do now is we are going to look at how it would actually look to create, or rather enable encryption on an object that we enable or upload to this bucket. All right, so I'm going to go into this March folder here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say upload. And then I'm just going to click and drag like a pretty small file over here. It'll go ahead and upload that. And what we are going to do, again, we'll leave, we're not really going to talk about like bucket ACLs or anything like that today. But if we expand properties, we can see here's like the storage class. We can enable that or edit that rather if we want to. But if we come down here, we can find ourselves in the server-side encryption section. And remember, server-side encryption means that it is going to be encrypted while it's at rest. In this case, it would be at rest in S3 in your bucket, okay? And then if you wanted to clarify that, always just click these info buttons or the learn more button. Those are always super helpful to kind of clear things up. All right. But here, right now, we're saying that, okay, we don't want to specify an encryption key, and the bucket settings, just for default encryption, are used to encrypt objects when storing them in S3. In other words, the settings on this bucket are set to just enable objects in this bucket, so it's just going to use that default S3 managed encryption. But if I wanted to specify an encryption key here, what I could do is I could say, okay, I want to just use the bucket settings for default encryption, right? Like, as we said, that's going to be S3 managed encryption, which is the most hands-off, kind of user-friendly way to incorporate encryption because you don't need to deal with keys, you don't need to rotate them, it'll do them approximately every 365 days for you. But if we wanted to get more granular with the control that we have over our encryption process and kind of the keys being used, we could come up here and select SSE KMS managed encryption, okay? And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to use a KMS key, right? So remember that CMK, the customer master key that actually kind of manages the encryption and the data encryption keys. It's actually going to encrypt the stuff in this bucket, all right? So if I have like a ARN that I wanted to enter here, as you can see, an ARN would kind of reference a specific key in a specific account in a specific region because KMS is a regional service. I could enter that ARN here. I could even create a new KMS key if I wanted to. Or if I had existing ones, I could just choose from that. So I can just go ahead and choose this kind of existing one here. And so now what this is doing is we are enabling SSE KMS, okay, as opposed to S3 server-side encryption. And that's going to be just a little bit more work on our part because it's going to require management of this KMS key as opposed to just being completely hands off and letting S3 handle all the kind of encryption operations and keys for us. All right. So again, we can leave a lot of these at their defaults. And for simplicity, I'm actually going to change this back to S3 just because, I'd rather keep things simple. And to keep it even simpler, we could just say use the bucket settings for default encryption. And this particular bucket is set to use S3 server-side encryption. Okay. So if we just go ahead and hit upload here, it'll upload that. So here's our object. So if we close this and we come back here and we look at our object, we now have an encrypted object sitting in here. And if we were to come in here, edit server-side encryption, maybe in the future we wanted to actually get more hands-on with our encryption, we could come in here and change it to KMS instead of S3. But again, I don't really need to do that today. You probably don't either. So I'm just going to hit cancel here. And that's it. Encryption is a relatively simple process to enable, which it should be because you're probably going to use it for the majority of your data that you're storing and using, especially, again, if you're in some kind of production environment in a company. All right. So let's go ahead and just clean up here so we're not paying for unnecessary storage. So I'm just going to go ahead and click delete that, and then we just need to confirm that we want to indeed delete this. All right, so it has successfully been deleted and it is gone. I'm just going to hang on to this actually. But you should have nothing, no objects here in your bucket, okay? And of course, if you didn't have a bucket, what you would do is you would just come in here and you would go to create bucket instead. And if we just kind of scroll down here, again, we're kind of ignoring ACLs for now. This is where you would set the default encryption behavior for a bucket that we were alluding to earlier. So the default for any object in this bucket is going to be S3 managed encryption, which the majority of the time I like to use because it's just one less thing for me to manage as opposed to using KMS. But if you did want to use KMS, you could say, okay, I want to use KMS, and then I want to specify a particular key that is going to be used to manage encryption within this entire bucket, right? So you have the option of just inheriting encryption from your bucket settings, or within each of your own objects, you could change what type of encryption management you're using, whether it's SSE S3 or SSE KMS. All right. So this is what you would do if you didn't actually have your own bucket to kind of working with now, but I believe by now you should at least have one bucket. But regardless, that's how you would kind of set up the configuration for your default bucket encryption behavior. All right. So let's come back over here, and since this is all done, we're back in the EBS or the EC2 console in our volume section here. Let's just go ahead and delete this volume just so it's not hanging around. Okay, perfect. So now it's gone. We're not paying for anything there. And again, delete your S3 object, and then you shouldn't be paying for anything. All right. So that is how you would enable and kind of work with encryption for EBS and S3, which are obviously very popular storage services that are going to be using encryption and are designed to use encryption if we're, being honest here from a security best practices standpoint. Okay. So hopefully that is helpful. That is how you work with S3 and EBS using encryption, and we will see you in the next lab.